There is a moment, so quiet, so fragile, that most people never even notice it. It comes just before sleep, when your body begins to let go, when your thoughts loosen their grip, and the world around you slowly fades into something softer, something distant, something that no longer demands your attention. Your breathing becomes slower, deeper, as if your lungs themselves are learning how to rest, and in that moment, a question appears. Not loud, not sharp, but gentle, almost like it was always there, waiting for you to become quiet enough to hear it. What if the ground beneath you remembers something that you don't? Not a story, not a voice, but something older, something pressed into the earth itself, beneath your body right now, beneath the walls around you, beneath the streets, beneath the layers of soil that have seen rain, heat, cold, and time. There are rocks, ancient rocks, silent, unmoving, but not empty. Inside them, there are traces, patterns, signatures left behind by events so old that even history has no name for them. And for a very long time, we believed those layers belonged only to nature, to volcanoes, to oceans, to slow and patient geological processes that shape the planet without intention, without memory. But something changed, something small, something almost invisible, something that should not exist. Scientists found it without searching for it, buried deep inside rock layers that formed millions of years before any human walked the earth. Tiny spheres, microscopic, perfectly formed, made from rare metals, metals that do not gather like this naturally, not in perfect shapes, not in such precise structures. And the strangest part, they were not isolated. They were everywhere, scattered across the planet, as if something had spread them, something that reached far beyond a single place, far beyond a single moment. And when scientists looked closer, something even more unsettling emerged. These particles were not random. They followed patterns, patterns that looked familiar, not ancient, not unknown, but disturbingly similar to something we already understand, something we have created ourselves, in our own time, in our own world. Because these same microscopic spheres appear after events that require extreme heat, controlled heat, unnatural heat, the kind of heat produced by advanced industrial processes, or something even more powerful. And suddenly, without warning, a quiet thought begins to form. Not as a conclusion, but as a possibility. What if this is not natural? What if this is not just geology? What if this is a trace, a leftover, a whisper from something that existed long before us, something that understood energy, matter, transformation, something that changed the planet in ways we are only beginning to understand? And yet, there are no cities, no machines, no structures, nothing that we can point to and say, this was built, this was created, this was theirs. Because time does not preserve things equally. It erases the obvious and protects only the subtle. Buildings fall, metals decay, structures collapse into dust. But chemical signatures, isotopes, microscopic particles, these remain, hidden, silent, waiting. And this is where the idea becomes deeper, slower, almost hypnotic. If a civilization existed millions of years ago and it disappeared completely, what would remain? Not its language, not its art, not its faces, but its impact. The way it touched the atmosphere, the way it used energy, the way it changed the chemistry of the planet. These things do not vanish easily. They sink, they settle, they become part of the earth itself, recorded in layers that do not forget. And now, imagine this, not as something dramatic, not as ruins or lost cities, but as something far more quiet, far more unsettling. Imagine that the Earth is not just a planet, but a memory. A slow, patient memory that does not think in years or centuries, but in millions of years. And within that memory, there are gaps, pauses, moments where something happened, something powerful enough to leave a mark, but not enough to survive the weight of time. And we are only now beginning to notice those marks. Small, scattered, incomplete, but real. And as you drift deeper into stillness, as your thoughts become softer, slower, less defined, allow this idea to settle gently, not as fear, not as urgency, but as wonder, a quiet, endless wonder that maybe, just maybe, we are not the first to ask questions under this sky. Maybe we are not the first to shape the world. Maybe we are simply the latest, the newest layer in a story written so slowly, so deeply, that it feels like silence. And as that thought fades, as your mind begins to loosen its hold on meaning, let the weight of it dissolve. Let it become distant, like a dream you almost remember. And as you drift, further, deeper, softer, the earth remains beneath you, quiet, patient, holding its secrets, not to hide them, but to keep them until someone is ready to listen. And as that quiet thought settles somewhere deep inside you, almost like it belongs there, the earth continues its slow, patient breathing beneath everything you know, beneath cities, beneath oceans, beneath time itself. And if you allow your mind to drift just a little further, just a little deeper, you begin to feel something unusual about this planet, something that does not match the simple story we were taught. Because the deeper scientists looked, the less complete that story became. The fossil record, which should be a perfect memory of life, is not perfect at all. It is broken, incomplete, filled with silences, like a book where most of the pages are missing, and only fragments remain, enough to hint at something vast, but never enough to explain it completely. There are moments in Earth's history where life does not slowly change. It jumps, suddenly, without warning, without the gradual steps we expect, as if something pressed fast forward on evolution itself. And one of those moments feels almost unreal, almost impossible. Over 500 million years ago, something known as the Cambrian explosion appeared in the record. But it does not feel like an explosion, not in the violent sense, but in the suddenness, in the quiet shock of it. Before this moment, life was simple, soft, almost invisible. Small organisms drifting in ancient oceans, without eyes, without complex forms, without structure. And then, almost instantly in geological time, everything changes. Oceans fill with creatures that can see, that can move with precision, that have shells, limbs, complex bodies, intricate designs that should have taken millions upon millions of years to evolve slowly, step by step. But instead, they appear, as if they were already finished, already complete, already ready. And the silence before them remains empty. No clear ancestors, no smooth transition, just a gap, A quiet gap where something should exist, but does not. And this is not the only time. Again and again, the Earth shows these strange rhythms. Long periods of stability, slow change, gentle balance, and then, suddenly, disruption, transformation, disappearance, followed by something new, something different, something that seems to arrive too quickly, too fully formed, as if the rules of time were briefly ignored. And scientists have tried to explain this. They speak of missing fossils, of conditions that do not preserve soft bodies, of natural processes that we do not fully understand. And all of these explanations carry truth. But sometimes, when patterns repeat too precisely, too consistently, a different kind of question begins to emerge, not as a conclusion, but as a possibility. What if these gaps are not just absence? What if they are aftermath? What if they are the quiet remains of something that once existed? Something that changed the environment so deeply, so completely, that life itself had to begin again, reshaping, adapting, evolving in response to conditions that no longer exist today. And as your thoughts slow even more, becoming softer, less defined, you can almost imagine it, not clearly, not sharply, but as a feeling, a distant impression of a world that looked different, sounded different, moved differently. A world where the air may have carried unfamiliar compositions, where oceans held altered chemistry, where energy moved through systems we do not recognize. And if such a world existed, if something intelligent once lived within it, something capable of shaping its environment, then its presence would not be preserved as buildings or machines. Those would fade, but its influence, its impact on the planet itself, would remain, hidden within chemistry, within isotopes, within patterns that seem natural, until someone looks closely enough to notice that they are not entirely natural after all. Consider the atmosphere, something so invisible, so constant, that we rarely think about it. And yet it holds one of the most detailed records of everything that has ever happened on this planet. Every eruption, every fire, every shift in climate, every change in life leaves a trace in the air, and that trace becomes trapped, preserved in ice, in sediment, in stone, like a memory that cannot be erased. And when scientists studied these ancient records, stretching back hundreds of thousands of years, they found something unexpected. Moments where greenhouse gases rise suddenly, sharply, far beyond what natural cycles would suggest, and then, just as quietly, they fall again, returning to balance, as if something caused the change and then disappeared, leaving the system to heal itself over time. And these patterns repeat, not once, not twice, but many times, always following a similar rhythm, always suggesting something coordinated, something large, something that affects the entire planet at once. And as you drift deeper into stillness, your mind, no longer trying to analyze, only to observe, you begin to feel the weight of that possibility, not as fear, but as something vast, something slow, something that moves on timescales far beyond human life. Because if a civilization once existed here, long before us, it would not need to be remembered to be real. It would only need to have touched the earth in ways that cannot fully disappear, and those touches, those faint, quiet fingerprints, may still be here, beneath us, around us, woven into the very structure of the planet itself, unnoticed, unnamed, but not gone. never truly gone. And as your breathing becomes even slower, even deeper, the question that began as a whisper begins to fade again. Not because it is answered, but because it no longer needs to be. It simply exists, drifting gently at the edge of your awareness, like a distant echo, like something remembered from a dream you cannot quite hold. And the earth, patient as always, continues to rest beneath you, holding its layers, holding its secrets, not in silence, but in a language so slow, so deep, that only time itself can understand it. And as the quiet rhythm of your breathing carries you deeper into stillness, the world becomes softer, heavier, as if everything around you is slowly dissolving into something more distant, more fluid. And in that drifting space, the story does not move forward quickly. It unfolds slowly, like something that has waited millions of years to be noticed. Because beneath the surface of what we think we understand, there are traces, not loud, not obvious, but persistent, quiet anomalies hidden inside the fabric of the planet itself. And one of the strangest of these traces lies in something so small, so invisible, that it almost escapes attention entirely. Isotopes, tiny variations in the structure of atoms, differences so subtle that they require precise instruments to even detect. And yet, they carry information, deep, undeniable information about processes that created them. And here is where the stillness of the story deepens, because when scientists began studying ancient rock layers more carefully, they noticed something that did not belong to normal planetary behavior: carbon isotopes trapped inside stone, showing patterns that feel disturbingly familiar, patterns that mirror what happens when vast amounts of fossil fuel are burned in a very short period of time. The kind of pattern we are creating right now, in the present, with our industries, with our energy systems, with our endless consumption of what the Earth has stored for millions of years. But these ancient signatures, they appear in layers that formed hundreds of millions of years ago, long before humans, long before anything we recognize as advanced life. And the scale of these anomalies is almost impossible to ignore, because to produce such a shift naturally would require events so massive, so extreme, that they should leave other obvious signs. And yet, the record feels incomplete, as if something happened, something powerful, but not fully explained. And this is where the mind begins to loosen its grip on certainty, not to replace it with fear, but with something softer, something more open. Because what if these isotopic shifts are not just random natural events? What if they are echoes, faint echoes of energy use, of systems that consumed resources, altered the atmosphere, and then vanished, leaving behind only the chemical memory of their existence? And as this thought settles gently, almost like a slow wave moving through your awareness, another layer of the Earth's quiet story begins to reveal itself. Metallic particles, microscopic, perfectly spherical, scattered through ancient sediments, made of titanium, of rare metals that require extremely high temperatures to form, temperatures far beyond ordinary natural processes, temperatures that suggest control, precision, repetition. And these particles are not isolated. They appear in specific layers, tied to specific moments in deep time, almost like signatures, almost like timestamps left behind by something that operated, then stopped. And what makes this even more subtle, more hypnotic, is the way these patterns repeat, not continuously, but in intervals, as if something rises, changes the world, and then disappears, allowing the planet to return to balance, slowly, patiently, over thousands, sometimes millions of years, before it happens again. And as your thoughts become even softer, more distant, the idea does not demand belief. It simply exists, floating gently in the quiet space of your mind. What if these are not coincidences? What if these are cycles? Long, slow cycles of emergence and disappearance, where something intelligent reaches a peak, touches the planet deeply, and then fades, leaving only fragments that future minds struggle to interpret. And this is where the story becomes almost dreamlike, because the evidence does not speak clearly. It does not point directly. It whispers. It suggests. It allows multiple explanations to exist at the same time. Natural processes, unknown mechanisms, or something entirely different. Something that we are only beginning to imagine. And yet, there is another trace, even stranger, even more difficult to ignore once seen. Synthetic-like compounds, particles that resemble materials we create today, materials that resist decay, that persist, that do not belong easily to natural chemistry. And these, too, appear in ancient sediments, in places untouched by human activity, in layers that formed millions of years ago. And they do not exist everywhere, only in specific moments, specific intervals, like brief appearances, followed by complete absence. And the pattern is what makes everything feel different, because randomness does not organize itself this way. Randomness does not leave consistent gaps, consistent returns, consistent signatures that align across different regions of the planet. And so the Earth, in its quiet, patient way, begins to feel less like a passive object and more like something that has experienced events, something that has been changed, not once, but many times, by forces that leave behind traces, subtle, persistent, undeniable once you begin to see them. And as your body sinks deeper into relaxation, as your muscles release tension you did not even know they were holding, this idea becomes softer, less sharp, more like a distant current carrying you slowly forward. Because you are no longer trying to solve it, you are simply allowing it to exist, allowing the possibility to drift through your awareness, without resistance, without urgency. And in that state, the question itself changes. It becomes quieter, slower, no longer asking what happened, but simply observing that something did, something that touched the chemistry of the world, something that altered the balance of air, of oceans, of matter itself. And then, slowly, gently, disappeared, leaving the Earth to remember in its own silent way, through atoms, through patterns, through traces too small to see, but too consistent to ignore. And as this thought fades into the softness of your mind, blending with the slow rhythm of your breathing, the planet remains steady, ancient, holding its layers, holding its memory, not to reveal everything at once, but to offer pieces, fragments, glimpses, to those who are quiet enough, slow enough, patient enough to notice. And now, as your awareness drifts even further, the story does not end. It simply deepens, becoming softer, heavier, more distant, like a dream that continues, even as you begin to let go. And as the slow current of your breathing continues to carry you deeper, softer, further away from the sharp edges of waking thought, the story begins to change again. Not suddenly, not abruptly, but like a shift in temperature you only notice after it has already happened. Because now, the Earth is no longer just remembering through stone or through chemistry. It begins to remember through something even quieter, something that lasts longer than metal, longer than cities, longer than bones. Plastic. A material so ordinary in your world, so common, so easily ignored, and yet it is one of the most persistent things humanity has ever created. It does not vanish quickly. It does not dissolve easily. It breaks, yes, but it does not truly disappear. It becomes smaller, finer, turning into particles that drift through oceans, settle into sediments, become part of the planet itself, and long after everything else fades, these particles remain, like a quiet echo of a civilization that once existed. And if you allow your mind to drift gently with this thought, you begin to understand something subtle, something almost comforting in its stillness, that anything which changes the earth deeply enough will leave something behind, even if it is only a whisper, even if it is only a trace too small to see. And now, imagine this, not sharply, not as a clear image, but as a feeling, as a slow-forming impression. What if materials like this, things that resist time, things that persist beyond decay, existed long before us? What if something created them, used them, spread them across the world, and then, slowly, disappeared, leaving only fragments hidden in places no one thought to look? And this is where the silence deepens again, because scientists have found something not loud, not widely understood, but quietly present in remote ocean sediments. Particles, microscopic, with structures that resemble synthetic polymers. Materials that behave almost exactly like plastic. And yet, they appear in layers that formed millions of years before humans ever existed, before industry, before chemistry as we know it. And they do not appear continuously. They appear in specific layers, separated by vast spans of time, like brief moments where something changed, something introduced materials that should not exist, and then nothing, only natural sediments again, as if whatever created them stopped, or vanished, or simply became something else. And as your thoughts slow even further, drifting gently through this quiet idea, it does not demand belief. It does not ask for certainty. It simply exists, like a distant memory you cannot fully recall, because the earth does not explain itself. It only presents patterns, and patterns, when repeated, begin to feel less like coincidence and more like something intentional, something that happened more than once. And this is where the imagination softens into something almost dreamlike. Because now you are not just thinking about one lost moment, one lost civilization, but cycles, slow, repeating cycles where something emerges, grows, transforms the world, and then fades, leaving behind only the smallest fragments of its existence, fragments that survive not because they were meant to, but because they could not fully disappear. And if such cycles exist, if they have happened before, then the planet you rest upon is not untouched. It is layered, not just with rock, but with history so deep, so quiet, that it feels like stillness. And as your body becomes heavier, more relaxed, sinking gently into the surface beneath you, another subtle realization begins to form. Not as a clear thought, but as a quiet feeling that the materials we create today, the things we believe define our time, may one day become nothing more than these same fragments, these same microscopic traces scattered through layers of earth, waiting, unnoticed, until something else, something new, looks closely enough to see them, and wonders, just as we are beginning to wonder now. And this thought does not need to feel heavy. It does not need to feel urgent. It can remain soft, distant, almost peaceful, because in the scale of deep time, everything rises, everything changes, everything fades, and something else always follows. Not quickly, not dramatically, but slowly, patiently, like the turning of seasons on a scale too vast to fully grasp. And somewhere within that endless rhythm, the idea of permanence begins to dissolve, replaced by something calmer, something quieter, a sense that nothing is truly lost. It is only transformed, reduced, scattered, and held within the memory of the planet itself. And as your awareness drifts even further, becoming softer, lighter, more fluid, the question that once felt sharp, what if we were not the first, now feels different. Less like a question, more like a quiet possibility, something that no longer needs an answer because it simply exists, gently, endlessly, beneath everything you know, and the earth, still breathing slowly beneath you, continues to hold its layers, its traces, its silent fragments of forgotten worlds, not hidden, not revealed, simply there, waiting in stillness as your mind drifts further and further into rest. And as your body continues to sink deeper into stillness, as if gravity itself has softened, become gentler, more patient, the story begins to unfold in a different direction, not outward, not toward the surface of things, but inward, deeper into the hidden memory of the planet. Because now, the traces are no longer just chemical, no longer just fragments of materials or subtle shifts in ancient air. Now, they begin to touch something more profound, something that feels almost impossible to ignore once it is noticed. Nuclear signatures, quiet, invisible, but unmistakable. Because there are certain processes in the universe that cannot hide, no matter how much time passes, no matter how deeply they are buried, and nuclear reactions are one of them. They leave behind patterns, precise, measurable, undeniable patterns that remain stable across millions, even billions of years. And for a long time, it was believed that such reactions, especially sustained ones, required intelligence, required control, required technology. But then, something unexpected was discovered. Deep within uranium deposits in Africa, a place where the Earth itself had once behaved in a way that seemed almost intentional. Natural nuclear reactors, systems that operated billions of years ago, long before life became complex, long before anything we would recognize as civilization. And this discovery changed something fundamental. It showed that under very specific conditions, the Earth itself could mimic processes we thought belonged only to advanced intelligence. And for a moment, that explanation felt complete, comforting enough. But as your thoughts drift more slowly, more deeply, a quieter layer begins to emerge. Because not all nuclear signatures are the same. Not all isotopic patterns can be explained by natural reactors. Some are too precise, too concentrated, too similar to something else entirely, something we understand very well, because we have created it ourselves. And this is where the stillness of the story becomes heavier, not with fear, but with depth. Because in certain ancient rock formations, Scientists have found isotope ratios that match exactly what is produced during nuclear detonations. Not similar, not approximate, but almost identical. Patterns that suggest controlled reactions, rapid energy release, specific conditions that do not arise easily in nature. And these signatures appear in layers that formed tens of millions of years ago, long before humanity, long before anything we consider technologically capable. And they do not appear everywhere. They are not random. They are located, specific, almost as if they mark events, moments, brief and intense, followed by silence. And as your breathing becomes slower, deeper, your mind no longer tries to resolve this contradiction. It simply allows it to exist, gently, quietly, because the earth does not rush to explain itself. It does not offer clear answers. It offers patterns, and patterns, when they repeat, begin to feel less like accidents and more like something that happened more than once. And this is where another layer of understanding begins to form, not as a thought, but as a sensation. That energy, on a large enough scale, always leaves a trace. Always. Whether it comes from natural forces or something that learns to control those forces. And if something once learned, if something once understood how to manipulate matter at its most fundamental level, then the marks of that understanding would not vanish easily. They would remain, hidden, subtle, but persistent, embedded in the very structure of the planet. And now, imagine this, not clearly, not sharply, but as a distant impression, a world where energy was used differently, where reactions were not accidental, but directed, where forces were harnessed, shaped, repeated, and then, slowly, everything stopped. Not with a clear ending, not with visible ruins, but with silence, deep, complete silence. And what remained was not the world itself, but the imprint it carried, the faint echo of something that once reached a level of understanding and then disappeared, leaving only signatures that future minds struggled to interpret. And as your awareness drifts further, becoming softer, less anchored to precise meaning, another subtle connection begins to form. Because these nuclear traces, they do not exist alone. They appear alongside other anomalies, shifts in atmosphere, sudden changes in life, disruptions that ripple through the fossil record, as if multiple systems were affected at once. And this correlation, this quiet alignment of patterns, begins to feel less like coincidence and more like a memory. Not a human memory, but a planetary one, slow, fragmented, but consistent. And within that memory, there is a rhythm, emergence, transformation, disappearance, repeated again and again across deep time. And this rhythm does not feel violent. It does not feel chaotic. It feels almost natural, as if even intelligence, even advanced understanding, becomes part of the same cycle that governs everything else, rising, reaching a peak, and then dissolving back into the quiet background of the earth. And as this idea settles gently into your mind, it no longer feels heavy. It no longer demands resolution. It becomes soft, almost calming, because in this vast scale, nothing is truly lost. Everything becomes part of the same slow process, transformed, reduced, preserved in ways that are not obvious, but not absent either. And now, as your breathing continues its slow, steady rhythm, the thought of energy, of power, of transformation begins to fade into something softer, something more distant, like a light seen far away, no longer bright, no longer overwhelming, just present, quietly, at the edge of awareness. And the earth, still beneath you, still patient, still holding its layers, continues to carry these traces, not as warnings, not as answers, but as fragments, pieces of a story that unfolds so slowly, so gently, that it feels like rest itself. And as you drift deeper, further, softer, the question no longer needs to be asked. It simply becomes part of the silence, blending with the steady rhythm of your breath, dissolving into the calm, until even that fades away. And as your mind continues to drift, softer, slower, as if each thought is no longer something you hold, but something that gently passes through you, the story begins to move again, not forward in time, but deeper into something that feels almost weightless, almost suspended, because now the earth is no longer only remembering through stone or through energy. It begins to remember through something far more delicate, far more persistent: ice, ancient ice, silent, unmoving, yet holding within it the most precise memory of the planet's breath. Because every layer of ice, formed slowly, patiently, year after year, carries within it tiny pockets of air, frozen moments of atmosphere, preserved exactly as they were, thousands, hundreds of thousands, even millions of years ago. And when scientists began to look into these frozen layers, not with urgency, but with careful, quiet attention, they discovered something that feels almost impossible once you notice it. The atmosphere itself has changed. Not slowly, not always gently, but sometimes suddenly, sharply, in ways that do not fully match the natural rhythm we expect. Because within these ancient air samples, there are moments where greenhouse gases rise, quickly, dramatically, far beyond what slow planetary processes should produce. And then, just as quietly, they fall again, returning to balance, as if something disturbed the system, something large, something coordinated, and then it stopped, leaving the planet to recover, slowly, patiently, over long spans of time. And these patterns, they do not appear only once. They repeat, again and again, across different layers, across different periods, always carrying the same quiet signature: sudden increase, sustained presence, gradual return, like a breath that was held too long and then released. And as your awareness drifts even deeper, you no longer try to explain it. You simply feel the rhythm of it, because this pattern, this rise and fall, is not chaotic. It is structured, almost intentional in its shape. And this is where the idea becomes softer, but deeper. Because what kind of force, what kind of process could alter the atmosphere of an entire planet so quickly, so precisely, and then disappear, without leaving obvious structures, without leaving visible ruins, only the memory of altered air, trapped inside ice, waiting, and the mind, in its quiet state, begins to open to possibilities, not as answers, but as gentle expansions. Because if something once existed, something capable of using energy on a global scale, something capable of changing the chemistry of the sky itself, then its presence would not need to remain visible. It would only need to leave behind these subtle shifts, these quiet imprints that persist far longer than any physical structure ever could. And now, imagine this feeling, not as a clear picture, but as a slow, distant impression. A world where the atmosphere was not simply something to live within, but something to shape, to adjust, to control, where the balance of gases, the warmth of the planet, the cycles of climate, were influenced, guided, perhaps even engineered, not violently, not abruptly, but carefully, over time. And if such a world existed, then these ice cores, these frozen layers of ancient breath, would be the only place where its memory could remain untouched. Because ice does not forget, it preserves, perfectly, silently, endlessly. And as this idea settles gently into your awareness, something else begins to emerge, something even more subtle. Because alongside these shifts in carbon dioxide, in methane, there are traces, faint, almost invisible traces of compounds that do not belong easily to natural systems. Molecules that resemble synthetic gases, highly effective at trapping heat, stable, precise, structured in ways that suggest design, not randomness. And these compounds, they appear in specific layers, specific moments, and then they vanish completely, leaving no continuous presence, no gradual decline, only absence, as if whatever created them ceased entirely. And this absence, this sudden return to natural balance, feels almost more significant than their presence, because it suggests something stopped, something ended. And, as your breathing slows even further, your body fully relaxed, fully supported, this idea no longer feels sharp. It becomes soft, almost distant, like something you are observing from far away. Because now the question is no longer what happened, but simply that something did, something that touched the sky, altered the balance of air, changed the way the planet held heat, and then disappeared, leaving only these quiet layers of frozen memory behind. And the Earth, in its slow, patient way, continues to carry these traces, not as evidence to be proven, not as messages to be decoded, but as fragments, gentle fragments of something that once reached a level of influence we are only beginning to approach. And as your awareness drifts even deeper, closer to the edge of sleep, the scale of this idea begins to dissolve. It no longer feels overwhelming. It no longer feels complex. It becomes simple, calm, almost peaceful, because in the vastness of time, everything becomes part of the same slow rhythm. Rise, change, fade, and return, again and again, endlessly. And somewhere within that rhythm, the thought of humanity, of our own impact, of our own changes to the atmosphere, begins to blend softly with everything else. No longer separate, no longer unique, just another moment, another layer, another quiet breath recorded in the memory of the planet. And as this thought gently fades, dissolving into the softness of your mind, the ice remains, silent, ancient, holding its frozen air, its perfect memory of what once was, and your breathing, slow, steady, continues to guide you further, deeper, into rest, where even these thoughts, even these questions, begin to disappear, leaving only calm, only quiet, only sleep. And as your breathing slows even further, becoming softer, deeper, as if each inhale and exhale is no longer something you control, but something that simply happens on its own, the story begins to move again. Not quickly, not sharply, but like something unfolding in the distance, something vast, something that cannot be rushed. Because now, the Earth is no longer only remembering through air, or ice, or subtle chemical shifts. It begins to remember through matter itself, through the structure of materials that should not exist, materials that feel almost out of place within the quiet logic of nature. Because there are certain things that the natural world does slowly, patiently, forming crystals over thousands of years, shaping minerals through pressure, through heat, through time. And then there are things that require intention, design, repetition, processes that do not happen randomly, no matter how long you wait. And as scientists began to examine ancient sediments from the deepest parts of the oceans, from places so remote, so untouched, that even modern influence struggles to reach them, they found something subtle, something almost invisible at first, but impossible to ignore once seen. Microscopic particles, structured, consistent, repeating across layers. Particles that resemble synthetic polymers, materials that behave like plastic, but exist in geological layers that formed millions of years before plastic was ever created by human hands. And this discovery, quiet as it is, begins to change the feeling of the entire story, because plastic, unlike stone, unlike metal, does not simply dissolve into nothing. It persists. It breaks into smaller and smaller pieces, but those pieces remain, drifting through water, settling into sediment, becoming part of the Earth's long memory. And if something like this appears in ancient layers, layers untouched by modern industry, then the question no longer feels distant. It feels close, soft, but present. What created it? And more importantly, why does it appear, and then disappear completely? Because these particles do not exist continuously. They are found in specific layers, separated by immense spans of time, as if something introduced them into the world, used them, spread them across the planet, and then stopped, leaving no continuation, no gradual fading, only silence. And as your mind drifts deeper into this stillness, you no longer try to force meaning onto this pattern, you simply allow it to exist. Because the Earth does not rush to explain itself, it offers fragments, and it allows those fragments to remain incomplete until someone is quiet enough, patient enough, to notice the connections between them. And these connections, once they begin to form, feel less like separate discoveries and more like pieces of a single, slow, repeating rhythm. Because alongside these polymer-like particles, there are other traces, metals that appear in spherical forms, requiring temperatures far beyond natural processes, isotopic signatures that mirror controlled energy release, atmospheric changes that rise and fall with unusual precision. And when all of these are placed together, not as proof, but as pattern, something deeper begins to emerge, something that feels less like coincidence and more like memory. Not a human memory, but a planetary one, a memory recorded not in language, but in matter, in chemistry, in the very structure of the world itself. And within that memory, there is a rhythm that repeats, not perfectly, not identically, but consistently enough to feel intentional, emergence, expansion, transformation, and then disappearance, followed by silence, long, quiet silence, where the planet returns to balance, slowly, gently, until the next disturbance appears, and as your awareness continues to soften, your body completely at rest, supported, heavy, calm. This idea no longer feels complex. It becomes simple, almost peaceful, because in the scale of deep time, even the most advanced systems, even the most complex structures become temporary, not because they fail, but because everything eventually returns to the same quiet state. Everything becomes part of the same slow process, breaking down, dispersing, integrating into the world that once supported it. And now, imagine this, not clearly, not as a sharp image, but as a distant sensation. A world where materials were created, not randomly, but intentionally, where substances existed that resisted decay, that persisted beyond the lifespan of the civilization that produced them. Materials designed for durability, for longevity, for function. And those materials, long after everything else faded, remained, reduced to microscopic fragments, scattered across oceans, embedded in sediment, waiting, not to be found, but simply to exist. And as this thought settles gently, almost like a slow wave passing through your awareness, another layer begins to form, because if such materials existed before, if something once created substances that persist across millions of years, then the boundary between natural and artificial begins to blur. It becomes softer, less defined, because over long enough time, everything becomes part of nature. Everything, no matter how it was created, becomes absorbed into the same slow cycles of the planet. And this realization, quiet as it is, begins to dissolve something deeper, the idea that we are separate, the idea that what we create exists outside of the natural world. Because in the end, everything returns. Everything becomes part of the same system, the same memory, the same slow unfolding of time. And as your breathing continues its steady rhythm, your thoughts, now barely forming, barely holding shape, this entire idea becomes softer, more distant, like something you once considered but no longer need to fully understand. Because it is no longer about answers. It is about presence, about allowing the possibility to exist without resistance, without urgency. And in that state, the earth beneath you feels different, not heavier, not more complex, but deeper, as if it holds layers upon layers of quiet history, not hidden, not revealed, simply there, existing beyond the need to be known. And as you drift further, deeper, closer to sleep, the patterns, the particles, the traces, all begin to fade into the same gentle silence, blending with your breath, blending with the stillness around you, until even the question itself, what came before, dissolves completely, leaving only calm, only quiet, only the soft, endless rhythm of rest. And now, as your body feels almost weightless, as if the boundary between you and the space around you has begun to soften, dissolve, the story shifts once more, deeper, quieter, slower than before. Because there is something else, something even more subtle than particles, more enduring than materials, something that does not simply remain in the earth, but flows through it, invisible, silent, yet everywhere at once, information, not written, not spoken, but encoded, hidden in the very structure of matter itself. And as your thoughts drift, becoming softer, more fluid, you begin to sense this layer of the story not as something you must understand, but as something you can gently feel. Because there are patterns, deep within crystals, within mineral formations, within structures that grow slowly, silently, over thousands, millions of years. Patterns that are too precise, too organized to be explained easily as random, because crystals, in their quiet growth, sometimes form geometries, repeating, perfect, structured in ways that mirror mathematical relationships. And for a long time, these were seen simply as natural beauty, as the elegant result of physical laws acting over time. But when examined more closely, with deeper attention, with instruments that can see beyond the surface, something else begins to emerge, something that does not feel entirely natural, because within certain crystalline structures there are arrangements, sequences, variations that resemble something else entirely, something familiar, something that carries meaning, not in the way language carries meaning, but in the way information is stored, preserved, repeated. And as this realization begins to settle, slowly, gently, the idea becomes almost dreamlike. Because what if these formations, these quiet, ancient crystals, are not only minerals? What if they are also records, not created intentionally as we understand it, but shaped in ways that allow information to persist, embedded within the lattice of matter itself? And if that were true, then the Earth would not only remember through chemistry, through atmosphere, through fragments of materials, it would remember through structure, through patterns that endure far longer than any surface trace ever could. And now, imagine this, not clearly, not as a sharp image, but as a distant sensation, a vast network beneath the surface, not built with metal or concrete, but grown, slowly, organically, through geological processes. A network of crystalline formations extending silently through the depths of the planet, each one holding patterns, each one carrying traces of something that once existed, something that understood not only how to shape the world, but how to leave something behind, something that could survive the endless passing of time. And as your breathing becomes even slower, deeper, more rhythmic, this idea does not feel overwhelming. It feels calm, almost peaceful, because it suggests something different, something softer, that intelligence, once it reaches a certain point, does not need to build outward, does not need to leave visible structures. It begins to merge, to integrate, to become part of the very systems that sustain the planet itself, and in doing so, it becomes invisible, not gone, but indistinguishable from the natural world. And this is where the story becomes even more quiet, even more distant, because if something once reached that level, if something once learned to store information not in fragile objects, but in the fundamental structure of matter, then its presence would not disappear. It would simply become part of the Earth, part of the slow processes that shape the planet over millions of years. And as your awareness drifts further, almost fully released from the need to analyze, you begin to feel the scale of this idea. Not in detail, but in depth. Because this is no longer about individual traces, no longer about isolated discoveries. It is about something continuous, something that flows quietly through everything, like a current beneath still water, always present, always moving, but never visible on the surface. And within that current, there is a sense of continuity, of something that does not end, but transforms, shifts, becomes something else. And this is where another gentle realization begins to form, not as a thought, but as a feeling, that perhaps the goal of intelligence is not to remain visible, not to leave monuments, not to resist time, but to become part of something larger, something that continues long after individual forms fade. And as this feeling settles, softly, gently, your mind no longer holds on to specific ideas. It simply drifts, carried by the slow rhythm of your breath. Because the story itself is no longer something you follow. It is something you float within, something that surrounds you like a quiet ocean, endless, calm, without edges. And within that ocean, the earth continues its slow, patient existence, holding its layers, its patterns, its silent networks of structure and memory, not waiting to be discovered, not needing to be understood, simply existing, as it always has, as it always will. And now, as your awareness fades even further, as thoughts become distant echoes, as the need to know, to question, to understand gently dissolves, everything becomes softer, quieter, lighter. The patterns fade, the structures dissolve, the questions disappear, leaving only the steady rhythm of your breathing. Slow, calm, continuous, and the deep, endless stillness beneath it. And in that stillness, there is nothing to hold, nothing to follow, nothing to resolve, only rest, only quiet, only the gentle, infinite drift into sleep. And as the last echoes of those distant patterns fade into the softness of your awareness, as if they were never meant to stay sharp, never meant to be held tightly, the story continues, not by becoming louder, but by becoming quieter, deeper, more distant, because now the earth is no longer only holding traces of matter, or energy, or hidden structures. It begins to reveal something even more subtle, something that does not exist in one place, but everywhere at once. Time itself, not as something that passes, but as something that shapes, something that slowly erases, and yet, at the same time, preserves, because time does not destroy everything equally. It chooses, quietly, patiently, what will remain and what will dissolve. And as your breathing continues its slow, steady rhythm, you begin to feel this, not as a concept, but as a gentle presence, a slow current that carries everything, civilizations, oceans, atmospheres, even entire ecosystems, forward, and then, eventually, into silence. And within that silence, something remains. Not clearly, not completely, but enough to suggest that something once was. And now, imagine this feeling, not sharply, not with detail, but as a distant awareness, that if something once lived here, something advanced, something capable of shaping the planet, then it would not vanish all at once. It would fade, slowly, layer by layer, leaving behind fragments that survive not because they were important, but because they could not fully disappear. And as this thought settles gently, your mind no longer tries to reconstruct the past. It simply observes the pattern, because the deeper we look, the more the same rhythm appears: emergence, growth, transformation, and then quiet disappearance, followed by long, peaceful stretches of balance where the earth heals, adjusts, returns to a state that feels natural again until something else, something new, begins. And this rhythm, it does not feel chaotic. It does not feel accidental. It feels almost inevitable, like a slow breathing of the planet itself, expansion, contraction, presence, absence, repeated again and again across spans of time so vast that they no longer feel measurable. And as your awareness drifts further, deeper, the idea of a single civilization, a single beginning, a single ending, begins to dissolve, replaced by something softer, something more continuous. Because now, it is no longer about one lost world, but many, not clearly separated, not sharply defined, but overlapping, blending into one another, each one leaving something behind, each one becoming part of the same slow, endless story. And within that story, there is no urgency, no need to rush, no need to fully understand, because everything unfolds exactly as it must, slowly, patiently, without force. And as your body becomes heavier, more relaxed, sinking deeper into stillness, another quiet realization begins to form, not as a thought, but as a feeling, that perhaps the reason we do not see clear evidence, the reason everything feels incomplete, fragmented, is not because nothing existed, but because time itself smooths everything, softens everything, until only the most subtle traces remain, traces that require stillness, attention, patience, to even notice. And as you drift deeper into that stillness, the need to question fades, the need to analyze dissolves, because now the story is no longer something you follow with your mind. It is something you feel, something that moves through you, gently, slowly, like a current beneath calm water. And within that current, the idea of ancient worlds, of forgotten civilizations, of patterns hidden beneath layers of time, becomes softer, less defined, no longer sharp enough to hold on to, and yet not completely gone, just distant, like a memory from a dream that you cannot fully recall, but still feel, somewhere deep, quiet, and calm. And the earth beneath you continues to exist exactly as it always has, steady, patient, holding its layers, its fragments, its silent record of everything that has ever been, not waiting to reveal, not trying to hide, simply being. And as your breathing becomes even slower, even more gentle, your thoughts now barely forming, barely holding shape, everything begins to fade, the patterns, the cycles, the questions, all dissolving into the same soft silence until there is nothing left to follow, nothing left to understand, only the steady rhythm of your breath, only the quiet presence of the moment, only the gentle, endless drift into rest. And as the quiet rhythm of your breath continues, slow, steady, almost weightless, the story no longer feels like something separate from you. It feels like something you are drifting inside, something that surrounds you without edges, without urgency. And within that calm, the earth reveals another layer, not of matter, not of energy, but of something even more subtle, something that moves silently through everything that has ever existed, life itself. Not just as organisms, not just as forms that appear and disappear, but as patterns. Patterns that carry memory, patterns that adapt, that change, that survive even when everything else fades. And as your awareness softens even further, you begin to feel this, not as a clear thought, but as a gentle presence. Because every living thing, every cell, every strand of genetic code carries within it a record, a quiet record of everything that came before, not written in words, but encoded, preserved, passed forward through time. And this is where the story deepens again. Because when scientists began to look into ancient genetic material, into fragments of DNA preserved in ice, in permafrost, in deep sediments, they found something unexpected. Patterns that do not fully belong to natural evolution, sequences that appear too precise, too coordinated, too consistent across different species, across different regions, across different moments in time. And these patterns, they do not dominate, they do not overwhelm. They exist quietly, subtly, like faint echoes embedded within the flow of life itself. And as your breathing becomes even softer, your thoughts drifting further from sharp meaning, the idea becomes gentle, almost dreamlike. Because what if life itself has been touched before? Not in ways that are obvious, not in ways that leave clear structures, but in ways that guide, that influence, that shape the direction of development over long spans of time. And if that were true, then evolution, as we understand it, would not be only random, not only driven by chance, but occasionally, quietly, influenced by something that understood how to work within it, not against it, but through it. And as this thought settles slowly, like something sinking into deep water, another subtle realization begins to form. Because these genetic traces, they do not appear in isolation. They align, gently, with other patterns, atmospheric shifts, material anomalies, cycles of emergence and disappearance. As if everything, life, environment, matter, energy, was affected together, not separately, but as part of the same quiet process. And this alignment, this soft connection between different layers of the Earth's memory, begins to feel less like coincidence and more like a rhythm, a slow, repeating rhythm that moves through deep time, touching different systems, leaving behind traces, and then fading. And as your awareness drifts deeper, your body completely at rest, your mind no longer holding tightly to meaning, this rhythm becomes simpler, calmer, easier to feel, because it no longer asks to be understood. It only exists, like the slow beating of something vast, something patient, something that does not rush. And within that rhythm, life itself begins to feel different. Not fragile, not temporary, but continuous, adapting, shifting, carrying forward pieces of what came before, even when the surface world changes completely, even when entire ecosystems disappear, even when civilizations, if they existed, fade without leaving visible traces. Something remains. Something always remains, quietly, deeply, within the patterns of life itself. And now, imagine this, not as a clear image, but as a distant sensation, a world where life was not only something to survive, but something to shape, to guide, to influence at its most fundamental level, where changes could be introduced not through force, but through subtle adjustments, through small shifts that ripple forward across generations. And if such influence once existed, then its traces would not appear as structures, not as ruins, but as patterns, embedded within the very code of living systems, waiting, not to be discovered, but simply to persist. And as this idea softens, blending gently with the rhythm of your breath, another layer of calm begins to settle, because now the question of what came before begins to dissolve. It no longer feels sharp, no longer feels urgent. It becomes part of the same quiet flow, part of the same endless unfolding. And within that flow, everything feels connected, not separate, not isolated, but part of a continuous process that moves slowly, gently, across time. And as your mind drifts even further, closer to the edge of sleep, even this idea begins to fade, becoming softer, less defined, like a memory that no longer needs to be held, and the earth beneath you, steady, silent, continues to carry its layers, its patterns, its quiet traces of everything that has ever been, not to explain them, not to reveal them, but simply to hold them, patiently, endlessly, as your breathing slows, as your thoughts dissolve, as everything becomes calm, still, quiet, and you drift deeper and deeper into rest. And as your breathing becomes so slow, so gentle, that it almost feels like the world itself is breathing with you, rising, falling, in perfect quiet rhythm, the story begins to dissolve even further, not into nothing, but into something wider, something that no longer feels like a sequence of ideas, but like a vast, endless space where everything exists at once, softly, quietly, without needing to be understood. Because now, the earth is no longer only a memory, no longer only a holder of traces. It becomes something else, something deeper, something that feels almost alive in a way that cannot be described, only sensed. Because when all the layers are considered together, the stone, the air, the ice, the patterns, the materials, the subtle echoes left behind, they begin to form something greater than individual evidence. They begin to feel like a system, a slow, interconnected system that carries forward the imprint of everything that has ever existed upon it. And within that system, there is a quiet continuity, something that does not break, does not end, but transforms, gently, endlessly, across spans of time so vast that they no longer feel like time at all. And as your awareness drifts deeper into this softness, your thoughts no longer move in straight lines. They drift, they expand, they dissolve. And within that drifting, a subtle realization begins to form, not as a conclusion, but as a feeling, that perhaps nothing that reaches a certain level of complexity ever truly disappears. It simply changes form, becomes less visible, less defined, merging into the deeper processes of the world itself. And if that is true, then any civilization, any intelligence, any system that once touched the planet deeply enough would not vanish completely. It would remain, not as structures, not as ruins, but as influence, as patterns that continue quietly beneath the surface of everything that follows. And as this idea settles gently, like something sinking into still water, The earth begins to feel different again, not as something separate from you, but as something you are part of, something you are resting within, supported by, connected to in ways that do not require thought, because now the story is no longer about what existed before. It is about continuity, about the possibility that everything that has ever existed here still exists in some form, woven into the fabric of the planet itself, carried forward in ways that are not obvious, but not absent either. And as your breathing continues its slow, steady rhythm, another layer of calm begins to unfold. Because if everything transforms rather than disappears, then there is no urgency, no need to hold on to anything tightly, no need to resolve every question, because everything continues, in some way, always. And within that calm, the idea of cycles becomes softer, more fluid, no longer a rigid repetition, but a gentle unfolding, like waves moving through a vast ocean, rising, falling, blending into one another without clear beginning or end, and somewhere within that endless movement there is a sense that intelligence itself, awareness itself, may be part of that same flow. Not fixed, not permanent, but continuous, appearing, evolving, dissolving, and reappearing in different forms, across time so deep that it feels like stillness. And as your awareness drifts even further, your body completely relaxed, your thoughts barely forming, this idea no longer feels complex. It becomes simple, almost comforting, because it suggests that nothing is truly isolated. Nothing exists alone. Everything is part of something larger, something that carries forward quietly, patiently, without interruption. And within that larger movement, the traces of the past, the patterns we have sensed, the anomalies hidden in stone and air and matter, begin to feel less like mysteries to be solved and more like gentle reminders, soft echoes of continuity, subtle signs that something has always been happening even when no one was there to notice. And now, imagine this, not as a clear image, but as a distant sensation, a world where intelligence reached a point where it no longer needed to build outward, no longer needed to leave visible marks, because it had learned how to exist within the systems of the planet itself, how to move with them, how to merge with them, becoming indistinguishable from the natural processes that sustain everything. And if such a state was ever reached, then its presence would not appear as evidence, not as something obvious, but as harmony, as balance, as subtle adjustments that maintain stability over long spans of time. And this thought, quiet as it is, begins to dissolve even the idea of disappearance, because now nothing truly ends. It only shifts. It only becomes something else, something softer, something less defined, but still present, still part of the same endless unfolding. And as your breathing becomes even slower, almost imperceptible, your awareness drifting closer and closer to the edge of sleep, everything begins to fade, not suddenly, not completely, but gently, like a light dimming over time, the patterns, the traces, the questions, all dissolving into the same soft silence until there is nothing left to follow, nothing left to hold, only the steady rhythm of your breath, only the quiet presence of the moment, only the deep, endless calm that surrounds everything. And within that calm, the earth continues, patient, silent, holding its layers, its patterns, its quiet continuity, not asking to be understood, not needing to be explained, simply existing, as it always has, as it always will. And as you drift deeper and deeper, everything becomes softer, everything becomes still, everything becomes quiet, until even this story, even these thoughts, gently dissolve, leaving only rest, only calm, only sleep. And as everything within you becomes softer, quieter, as if even the smallest tension has slowly dissolved into the stillness, the story no longer feels like something separate from your awareness. It feels like something you are floating inside, something without edges, without beginning, without end. And within this endless calm, another layer begins to unfold, not through force, not through explanation, but through a slow, almost invisible shift in perception. Because now, the earth is no longer only holding memory. It begins to feel like something that observes, not in a conscious way, not in a human way, but in a deep, passive way, as if everything that has ever happened upon it has been quietly witnessed, absorbed, recorded, without judgment, without interruption. And as your breathing continues its slow, steady rhythm, you begin to sense this differently, because the idea of the past, of lost civilizations, of traces hidden in matter and air, begins to merge into something larger, something more continuous, something that does not feel like separate events, but like a single, endless process, unfolding across deep time. And within that process, there is no clear boundary between what is natural and what is created, because over long enough spans of time, everything becomes part of the same system. Everything blends, everything dissolves into the same slow rhythm. And as this thought settles gently, your mind no longer tries to separate things. It simply allows them to exist together. Because now, another possibility begins to emerge, soft, distant, almost like a whisper at the edge of awareness. What if the most advanced forms of intelligence do not leave behind structures at all? What if they do not build outward, do not shape the world in visible ways, but instead learn to exist within it, to merge with it, to become part of the systems that sustain the planet itself? And if that were true, then their presence would not appear as anomalies, not as disturbances, but as balance, as stability, as the quiet maintenance of conditions that allow everything else to continue. And this idea, gentle as it is, begins to shift the feeling of everything that came before, because now the patterns, the cycles, the traces no longer feel like remnants of something that failed. They begin to feel like stages, steps in a process that moves towards something more integrated, more subtle, more deeply connected to the world itself. And as your awareness drifts even further, your body completely at rest, your thoughts now barely forming, this idea becomes calmer, more distant, because it no longer asks to be understood. It simply exists, like a slow current beneath still water, always present, always moving, but never demanding attention. And within that current, there is a sense of continuity, not of beginnings and endings, but of transformation, where each phase leads quietly into the next, without clear separation, without finality. And now, imagine this, not clearly, not with detail, but as a feeling. A world where intelligence reached a point where it no longer needed to change the surface of the planet, because it had learned how to work within the deeper systems, within the atmosphere, within the oceans, within the slow cycles of geology itself, guiding, adjusting, maintaining balance in ways that are too subtle to detect. And if such a state once existed, then its traces would not appear as disruption, but as harmony, as periods of stability so precise, so sustained, that they seem almost natural, even though they may not be entirely so. And as this thought settles gently into your awareness, another quiet realization begins to form, not as a clear idea, but as a sensation, that perhaps the most advanced stage of any system is not expansion, not visibility, but stillness, integration, becoming part of something larger without standing apart from it. And within that stillness, everything continues, quietly, endlessly, without the need for recognition. And as your breathing becomes even slower, even softer, the distinction between you and the space around you begins to fade. Because now there is only calm, only the gentle rhythm of rest, only the quiet presence of being. And within that presence, the earth remains steady, patient, holding everything that has ever existed within its layers, not as separate stories, but as one continuous unfolding, one endless movement that never truly stops. And as your awareness drifts closer to sleep, even this idea begins to dissolve, becoming softer, lighter, less defined, until it is no longer something you follow, but something you gently release. And in that release, there is no question left, no need to understand, only the steady rhythm of your breath, only the deep, quiet stillness that surrounds everything. And within that stillness, everything rests. Everything becomes calm. Everything becomes silent as you drift deeper and deeper into sleep. And as your awareness continues to drift, slower, softer, as if every remaining thought is no longer something you hold, but something that gently dissolves before it can fully form, the story begins to fade into something even deeper, something that no longer feels like a narrative, but like a presence, a quiet, endless presence that exists beneath everything. Because now, the earth is no longer only a place where things happen, it becomes something that carries continuity itself, not through events, not through visible change, but through a slow, unbroken flow that moves silently beneath all transformations. And as your breathing continues its calm, steady rhythm, you begin to sense this flow not as time passing, but as something more still, something that remains even as everything else changes. And within that stillness, another layer of understanding begins to unfold, not as a thought, but as a feeling, that perhaps the reason everything seems fragmented, incomplete, broken into pieces we struggle to connect, is not because something is missing, but because we are only able to see small parts of something that has always been continuous, always been whole. And as this idea settles gently, your mind no longer tries to assemble the fragments, it simply allows them to exist as they are, soft, distant, unresolved, because now the need for clear answers begins to dissolve, replaced by something calmer, something quieter, a sense that everything is already complete, even if it is not fully understood. And within that calm, the patterns we have followed, the traces in stone, the shifts in air, the hidden structures, the subtle echoes of something that may have existed before begin to lose their sharp edges. They soften, blend into one another, becoming part of a single, continuous movement that no longer feels separate from the present moment. And as your awareness drifts even deeper, your body fully relaxed, supported, weightless, this movement becomes almost imperceptible, like a current so gentle that it can only be felt when everything else is still. And within that current, there is no beginning, no ending, only a slow, endless unfolding that does not rush, does not stop, simply continues, quietly, without interruption. And now, imagine this, not clearly, not as a defined image, but as a distant sensation, that everything that has ever existed, every system, every form of life, every moment of awareness is not separate, but part of this same continuous flow, appearing briefly, taking shape, and then dissolving back into the same stillness from which it came. And if that is true, then even the idea of past civilizations, of lost worlds, of hidden traces beneath the surface of the earth, becomes softer, less defined, because nothing is truly lost, nothing is truly gone. It simply changes form, becomes quieter, becomes part of the deeper structure of reality itself. And as this realization gently settles into your awareness, it no longer feels like something to think about. It feels like something to rest within, something that allows everything to slow down, to soften, to release. And within that release, the need to search, to question, to understand begins to fade, replaced by a deep, steady calm that does not depend on answers. And as your breathing continues, slow, even, effortless, the distinction between you and the space around you becomes softer, less defined, because now there is only the experience of being, quiet, still, present. And within that presence, everything feels complete, even without explanation, even without clarity. And as your awareness drifts closer and closer to sleep, even this sense of presence begins to dissolve, becoming lighter, more distant, until it is no longer something you notice, but something you simply are. And in that state, the earth beneath you, the layers of time, the patterns, the traces, all become part of the same soft silence, blending into the calm, dissolving into the stillness, until there is nothing left to follow, nothing left to hold, only the steady rhythm of your breath, only the deep, quiet rest that surrounds everything. And within that rest, everything becomes softer, everything becomes still, everything becomes silent, as you drift, gently, endlessly, into sleep. And as the last traces of defined thought continue to dissolve, as if even the idea of thinking itself is slowly fading into something softer, something more distant, the story no longer unfolds in words. It unfolds in sensation, in presence, in a quiet awareness that no longer needs direction, because now everything has become slower, deeper, more still than before. And within that stillness, another layer begins to emerge, not as something new, but as something that was always there, waiting beneath everything else, because the deeper you drift, the more it begins to feel that nothing in this story has ever truly been separate. Not the earth, not the patterns, not the traces, not even you. Everything has always been part of the same continuous field, the same quiet existence that moves without effort, without interruption. And as your breathing continues, calm, even, effortless, this idea becomes softer, more natural, because now there is no need to separate past from present or presence from memory. Everything begins to blend gently into one continuous experience, where nothing is truly before and nothing is truly after, only a slow, endless unfolding that exists beyond time as you once understood it. And within this unfolding, the idea of civilizations, of emergence and disappearance, begins to feel different, less like isolated events, and more like temporary patterns, brief shapes that appear within something much larger, much more constant, like ripples forming on the surface of still water, and then fading back into it, leaving no sharp boundary, no clear division, only the quiet return to stillness. And as this realization settles gently, your awareness no longer tries to follow a path. It simply rests, because there is nothing left to reach, nothing left to discover, only the experience of being carried, slowly, gently, by something that does not rush, does not resist, simply continues. And now, imagine this, not clearly, not with detail, but as a feeling that moves through you without effort, that everything that has ever existed on this planet, every form, every structure, every trace, has always been part of this same slow movement, appearing when conditions allow, dissolving when they change, but never truly leaving, never truly ending, only transforming, becoming quieter, becoming less defined, until it blends completely into the stillness from which it came. And if that is so, then even the deepest mysteries, even the patterns hidden beneath layers of time, do not need to be solved. They do not need to be understood. They simply need to be allowed to exist, softly, quietly, without resistance. And as your body becomes even more relaxed, fully supported, fully at rest, the sense of separation continues to fade, because now there is no clear boundary between you and the stillness around you, no edge where one ends and the other begins, only a continuous field of calm, a quiet presence that holds everything equally, without effort, without change. And within that presence, even the idea of the earth, of its layers, of its deep hidden memory, begins to soften, becoming less like an object and more like a gentle awareness that carries everything within it, effortlessly, endlessly. And as this awareness deepens, the story itself begins to dissolve, not abruptly, not completely, but gradually, gently, like something that was never meant to remain sharp, never meant to stay in focus, because its purpose is not to be held, but to guide you here, into this state of quiet, into this space where nothing is required, nothing is expected, nothing needs to be understood. And as your breathing continues, slow, steady, almost imperceptible now, even this awareness begins to fade, becoming lighter, more distant, until it is no longer something you notice, but something you are. And in that state, there are no questions, no patterns, no traces to follow. Only stillness, only calm, only the deep, endless quiet that surrounds everything. And within that quiet, everything rests, everything softens, everything becomes silent as you drift gently, effortlessly, deeper and deeper into sleep. And now, as your awareness has become so soft, so distant, that even the idea of following a story feels unnecessary, the final layers of everything begin to dissolve, not into emptiness, but into something deeper, something quieter, something that no longer needs form, because you are no longer listening. You are no longer thinking. You are simply drifting, gently, endlessly, carried by a rhythm that feels older than thought itself. And within this rhythm, something remains, not as an idea, not as a memory, but as a presence, a quiet, infinite presence that has been there from the very beginning and will remain long after everything else has faded. Because now, the earth, the patterns, the traces, the possibility of worlds before this one no longer feel separate from you. They no longer feel like something outside. They feel like something you are resting within, something that holds you, supports you, carries you without effort, without movement, without change. And as your breathing continues, slow, steady, almost imperceptible, the boundary between inside and outside, between you and everything else, begins to disappear completely. Because now, there is no separation, no distinction, only a single, continuous field of stillness. A quiet space where everything exists without needing to be defined, without needing to be understood. And within that space, even the idea of time fades. Because time, which once felt like something that moves, something that carries events forward, now feels still, like something that simply is, something that does not pass, does not change, but exists all at once, quietly, endlessly. And in this stillness, the idea of past civilizations, of hidden traces, of patterns beneath the surface of the earth becomes softer, more distant, because it no longer matters what came before or what may come after. Everything that has ever existed, everything that will ever exist, is already part of this same quiet presence, this same endless calm. And as this realization settles, gently, deeply, there is nothing left to follow, nothing left to question, nothing left to hold, because everything has already dissolved into the same soft stillness, the same infinite rest. And within that rest, there is no effort, no movement, no need to remain aware, because awareness itself begins to soften, to fade, to dissolve into something even deeper, something that does not observe, does not think, but simply exists, quietly, endlessly, without form, without boundary. And as you drift further, deeper, softer, even the sensation of drifting begins to fade, because there is nowhere to go, nothing to reach, nothing to leave behind, only stillness, only calm, only the quiet presence that holds everything equally, without change, without interruption. And within that presence, everything is complete. Everything is at rest. Everything has already arrived. And now, even this, even these final traces of thought begin to dissolve, becoming lighter, more distant, until they are no longer something you notice, no longer something you follow. They simply fade, gently, softly, into the same endless silence. And in that silence, there is nothing left, nothing to hold, nothing to understand, only the steady, quiet rhythm of rest, only the deep, infinite calm that surrounds everything. And as you drift, beyond even the idea of drifting, beyond even the sense of being here, everything becomes still, everything becomes quiet, everything becomes sleep. Now, somewhere between the last echo of thought and the first true moment of sleep, something changes again, not outside, but inside, quietly, deeply, because after everything you have drifted through, every pattern, every trace, every soft possibility that something existed long before you, something begins to return, not as noise, not as fear, but as clarity, slow, calm, but undeniable. Because the story was never only about the past. It was never only about what came before. It was always, quietly, about this moment, about you, about what is happening now. And as your breathing continues, slow, steady, grounding you gently in this calm, the earth beneath you no longer feels distant, no longer feels like something ancient and unreachable. It feels close, present, alive in a quiet, steady way. Because everything you imagined, everything you felt, all the traces, all the hidden patterns, all the silent memories of the planet, they lead to one simple realization. Something has always been happening here. Something continuous. Something that does not stop, does not disappear, only changes form. And now, you are part of it. Not separate, not observing from the outside, but within it, as it continues. And as this realization settles gently, your mind becomes slightly clearer, not fully awake, but aware enough to feel it. Because if civilizations existed before, if something once rose, changed the world, and vanished into silence, then there is one question that remains, soft but powerful. What happens next? And that question does not feel heavy. It does not demand an answer. It simply opens, like a door that was always there, waiting, because the future is not something distant. It is not something separate from the past. It is the same process, continuing, right now, through you, through everything that exists in this moment. And suddenly, very quietly, the perspective shifts, because all those patterns, the cycles of emergence and disappearance, the traces hidden in the earth, they no longer feel like something mysterious and unreachable. They feel like something familiar, something repeating, something that is happening again. But this time, you are here, aware, present, part of it. And this is where the story becomes powerful again. Not loud, not dramatic, but deeply real. Because now, the idea of lost civilizations is no longer just a question of the past. It becomes a reflection, a quiet mirror, showing what happens when something rises, grows, transforms the world, and then, slowly, fades. And within that reflection, there is no fear, only awareness. Because for the first time, you are not just imagining what was, you are sensing what is and what may become. And as your breathing remains slow, calm, steady, your mind no longer drifts away completely. It rests, balanced between sleep and awareness, Because this final moment is not about disappearing into silence. It is about understanding something, gently, without effort. Because if everything before you followed the same rhythm, if everything rose, reached a peak, and then dissolved, then the question is not whether it happened. The question is whether it will happen again. And within that question, there is something else, something quiet, something that feels almost like a choice, not a forced decision, not something urgent, but a soft awareness that this moment, right now, matters, because you are part of the same story, part of the same cycle. But unlike everything before, you are aware of it. And that awareness, calm, quiet, gentle, is something different, something new. And as this thought settles, it does not create tension, it creates stillness. Because now, you are no longer searching for answers. You are simply present, feeling the weight and the calm of being part of something much larger, something that has always been unfolding, long before you, and will continue long after. And within that understanding, there is peace, deep, steady peace, because you do not need to control it. You do not need to solve it. You only need to exist within it. And as your awareness begins to soften once more, gently returning to rest, the sharpness of thought fades again. But this time, it does not feel like losing something. It feels like releasing, like letting go of the need to hold everything at once. Because now, you have seen enough, felt enough, to allow yourself to rest, fully, deeply, completely. And the earth beneath you, steady, silent, ancient, continues exactly as it always has, carrying its layers, its patterns, its quiet story, forward, slowly, endlessly. And now, you drift again. But this time, without questions, without tension, only calm, only stillness, only the gentle rhythm of your breath guiding you, deeper, softer, further away from thought, and closer to rest. And as everything fades, as the last traces of awareness dissolve into the quiet, there is only one thing left. Not a question, not a mystery, but a feeling. A calm, steady feeling that you are exactly where you need to be. And nothing more is required. Nothing more is needed. Only rest. Only quiet. Only the soft, endless drift into sleep.